Standing room only today.
Today
Said not exactly standing room only today. Please, please, everyone can get a seat.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to proposal review session number 6. The last session we have scheduled to review individual proposals. We have, in addition to the folks in the room, I see Jody online, I think Carolyn may be joining online as well. Hi, Jody. And I know Rashad is not able to come because of the conflict with his board of trustees. I imagine others will be trickling in as the afternoon goes on.
And Jim is under the weather up here.
And Jim's under the weather. This afternoon, a few things. We circulated a memo on Wednesday that shares some thoughts and perspective some thoughts and perspective on some of the additional ideas, particularly those focusing on competitiveness that were lifted up at our last meeting. And so we'll start today by going through those and giving commissioners an opportunity to comment, weigh in on those as they see fit. Richard will walk through the first 3, and then I'll briefly talk about the last 4, and then we'll have a chance to have conversations as we've done in the past. I don't imagine that'll take the bulk of our time today. Following that, I think it's really an opportunity to talk about the piece of paper that Becky just handed around, which is our attempt to, in very rough terms and very approximate terms, capture where some commissioner sentiment seems to lie on a number of proposals. It is certainly not intended to rule anything in or out. It is really intended to provoke and prompt discussion. So we'll get to that after we go through these individual first 2 proposals. I'll note that these first 2 proposals are reflected on this sheet, but since we haven't had any conversation yet, we left that cell blank in terms of Commissioner Pudgman. And this is very much, again, very much a drag. And then
Hey Nick, for those of us on the, can Becky just email that to us?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Should have said that earlier. And then I want to talk a little bit about the schedule going forward, following up on some of the conversations we had last week. We have over 100 people at this point registered for our town hall on November 6th, which we have invited people to come to share their view on all the proposals that we have reviewed, and we'll be able to use that feedback as well as written feedback that we receive. We've asked for written feedback by the 7th. We'll be able to use that and factor it into the development of a draft package of recommendations for your consideration, starting on November, with our meeting on November 14th. So we'll have a chance to talk at the end of this meeting about schedule. Does that make sense as a way to go forward? Richard, can I ask you to start off the conversation about the individual proposals?
You can ask or instruct. So we will be running through a list of proposals that kind of fit under this competitive umbrella. We'll jump around taxes a bit, but they all fit the theme. You have the proposals
with the memo you sent.
Memo that was sent, correct. Okay. And the first option in the memo is reducing the corporate franchise tax rate. Bit of overview: the corporate franchise tax is paid by C corporations doing business in the district. Now, that is not all businesses. In fact, most businesses, if you look at national data, 95% are what we call pass-through entities. We've talked about this at length. It's important to the district where you have a business, but you pass through the profits and pay the tax on your individual income. But for those C corporations with economic activity in the district, they pay the business franchise tax, and after a recommendation from the 2013 DC tax revision, they apportion their income if they are a multi-state corporation based on single sales factor. That means that if a company, Walmart's, McDonald's, or invent one in your head, broadly speaking, if 10% of their sales are in the district, 10% of their income goes to the district for tax. We recommended that because traditionally the factor was based also on the business's property and employment, And by switching to single sales, you therefore don't penalize or raise the tax bill by a company that has more employees or more property in the District of Columbia. Currently, the district's corporate franchise tax rate is 8.25%. That was lowered also on the 2013 DC Tax Revision Commission's recommendation from 9.975% back in 2013. Currently, the rate in Maryland is the same in DC, 8.25%. Virginia's rate is lower, 6.0%. So this proposal would reduce DC's corporate franchise tax rate to 6%. Why would you do that? One, as we argued explicitly in the 2013 tax revision report, it's a great signal to the business community that DC cares about business. Even if most businesses don't get the tax cut, even if businesses don't identify it as the most cumbersome tax, it's a good way to put in big letters, DC is open business, we are competitive, we are trying to help the business community. And then additionally, there's been a lot of activity in this area. According to the Tax Foundation, 13 states have lowered their corporate income tax rate since 2021. Why would you not do it? Again, because most businesses do not pay this tax, the tax reduction, the tax relief would not actually go to a lot of DC businesses, including a lot of small businesses. Also, again, because we now use single sales factor, because we made the argument that it was better for shifting the burden onto companies that don't have employees and property in DC. The inverse is true now when you cut the rate. You would now be sending the benefit mostly to these larger companies that don't necessarily have a large economic footprint in the district. And also, if you kind of look at, for example, the Regional Tax Foundation puts out this business climate study every year. They just published their 24 version. And if you look, they do not care for DC's business climate too much. But the tax that scores the best is the corporate rate because of those previous things. Now again, in 2013, we argued that this was a way you could get your rate down close to Maryland. You can't get that commercial tax rate down. And you can make a similar argument today where, maybe it's not the worst tax, but you could do maybe the most headline generating thing by getting it down. We don't have an official ORA score, but we believe that it would cost roughly $200 million to get it down to 6%, or about $22 million for each 0.25 percentage point. With that, let's turn it over.
So I think this is something that we should be considering for the reasons that you mentioned, which is broadly speaking, the signals we spend to business. I would put a pin in it. Let us look a little deeper into what the financial implications are. I think the signals that it sends are substantial, especially when you look at income tax on business around the country. Also, given the real dearth of options that have been presented to us on how to improve the business climate, we have to take the few that are presented seriously and give them a second look. It's just my 2 cents. I know that there have been some pretty substantial changes recently in taxes. We're looking to adopt, for instance, there's a lot of interest in adopting the New Hampshire model, a place where people pay no income tax, and there where just this June, New Hampshire eliminated all of the dividend and interest taxation will be completely phased out by 2025. So, we're in the midst of a lot of folks going in a different direction, and that's making it worse. If we were to just stand still, us just standing still is making us in a less better position. Call it a race to the bottom if you want, but states are going in the other direction.
How are they making up the difference, do you know?
Sorry?
How are they making up the difference? The
New Hampshire?
Yeah.
They just have revenue surplus. New
Okay.
Hampshire and those 13 states that cut their corporate income tax rate, the 10 plus who've cut their individual income tax rate, they have not in any way done a one-to-one exchange. They had revenue surpluses and they used that to cut it. That's what made it politically easier to do than past efforts.
And that's very much what I've been recommending through triggers. Just long story short, one of my dear friends is a state senator from New Hampshire, and she and I had a great conversation today. And she's a Democrat. She's on the left of the left in New Hampshire, albeit that's probably a moderate in the district. And we talked openly about the approaches they're taking, some of which she has some very real concerns with from a financial long-term effect. But there's a lot going on in these ecosystems. My only point is, Richard, we should be careful about adopting one part without understanding the entire ecosystem that these states are operating in. because it is not one for all.
Do we have any data or evidence on the impact of the rate cut from the last tax revision commission?
I don't specifically.
Sorry, what's the question?
On the
If
effect
there's
of
any
the rate.
data or evidence on the impact of the last rate cut and whether it had the intended effect. You know, I think for me, I don't know why this would be a priority for us. I mean, just the fact that this wouldn't be going to most businesses here in the district. Taxes that affect more businesses, and we should also be thinking about the businesses that are most in need, and to me, multi-state, multinational corporations that are gonna probably reap the biggest benefit from these rate cuts are not it. And I don't, I'll be interested to hear if there's anything out there evaluating the last time we did this tax cut, but I'm guessing nobody's actually looked at it.
Again,
I think Erica's question is spot on, but I think the big words for me in this is strong signal. So whatever we produce does have to have a signal to the business community that we heard you and we're concerned. So I would just say it's probably signal to business that we hear you and we share your concerns.
what all I'm suggesting is that it be in the mix
Whatever,
as
sure.
we are thinking about options. And once we have these options, 10 in each category or whatever, then we start looking and see, well, what makes sense? How does this whole puzzle fit together? That's all.
I think we should keep this in the mix, in that I think there's a couple of things that we have been charged with as guiding principles, and broadening our base or enlarging our base is number one. And I think people are going to want to work closer to their jobs. We have to think about jobs. So I think a big signal to the business community is important. And I think economic efficiency and competitiveness is another one of our key principles. So I'm not sure that we have to go all the way to Virginia or not, but we certainly have to be more competitive. And I think these are the kind of things that need to be in the mix when we're making our final reviews of this package.
Just as a final thought, again, if we go forward, I've let my skepticism about the New Hampshire business activity tax be known. The notion of taxing, it's essentially a payroll tax is what it will boil down to. It is a tax on employees that we will be paying, so we should know that. I mean, people genuinely understand what a payroll tax is, and that's what this business activity tax is. If we're going to do it in an effort to get people who are currently not paying, there's quite a lot of money here that we could get. The 0.5% VAT is very close to what New Hampshire has. I think it's 0.72%. So it's in the neighborhood. All right. If we were to do that, the revenue created by that could lower the general corporate income tax. So if we have $242 million, Mr. Mayor, that is in a 0.5% VAT, when we look at paying off other things, what are we going to do with this money? And again, I'm willing to negotiate my own objection to the concept, but it could be part of that $242 million could be buying down a lower corporate income tax. So you're broadening the base and providing relief to some who are currently paying it. Again, all in the spirit of compromise, I think that's worthy of it.
raising question of where we are in the whole analysis. It's just like a nightmare where we are in the whole analysis of competitiveness and how we're doing on that. What I would add to that whole continuing debate is something else to think about. I talked last time about broadening the base versus expanding the base. I think when we're talking about a lot of these taxes, there's a difference between causation and correlation. Something can be correlated in cost, or it can be only correlated. I think there definitely is a correlation between well-managed states or states with a reputation for being well-managed, lower costs of government, and having good tax. You can say there's no causation, but there definitely is a correlation in the investor's mind, and that's important. This is just my view, so I think that we should definitely keep it in here. And I definitely would endorse David's notion, which has been my abiding sense all along, that wherever we are broadening the base, we should use that for a very focused, selective investment like early childhood or family and tax relief. My view.
Excellent. Further thoughts? Okay. With that, I'll roll into the next proposal. This is M9, raise the estate tax threshold. Again, current law, broad overview, and estate tax is levied on the deceased. In 2023, DC excluded $4.528 million worth of value, which means that if you had an estate worth $3 million in value, you did not pay, did not have to file. If you earned above that, the amount above it is what you pay tax on. So if you earned even a $5 million estate, you would pay roughly $500,000 for the tax, and so on. The current DC estate tax affects about 100 estates annually, although of course that fluctuates a lot. The estate tax is inherently valuable because, to be blunt, it depends on people dying, and you can't technically protect that. The exemption level was at $1 million in 2013 when the DC Tax Revision Commission recommended that it be raised to the then federal level of $5.25 million. That was done both as kind of a competitive tax cut thing, but also a simplicity thing of getting rid of the idea that some households would have to file a DC estate tax but not have to file a federal one because the DC was below the federal. So we put it in line with the federal. Then the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act significantly increased the federal exemption. As such, DC and other states, again, decoupled from the federal amount and set their own amount. So again, the DC level is now below the federal amount. Currently, the DC threshold is at, what I say, 4.5. So the proposal would be to raise it to 5.25, which is where the 2013 Commission recommended it, or to go to roughly 7 million, or speaking what that would be with inflation adjustments since that recommendation was made. The reason you would raise the threshold is because, again, you would be exempting more households from the tax. The higher it goes, the more families don't have to file anything, even if they don't owe significant amounts. And because it might encourage residents who are currently in DC to stay here instead of moving to a state without an estate tax, like Virginia and Florida. The argument against is this tax.
Oh, wait, before you go, how much do we raise from this every year?
We currently raise $48 million a year.
How much?
Roughly 50, but again, that varies significantly because it's based on people dying.
I get it, thank you.
Spike up.
Can we have a moment of levity? Remember in 2001?
Talk about this a lot.
We had, after 9/11, we were just crushed, and we had this big estate. We had one of our luminaries die that produced $100 million, and we were able to balance our budget on back when Katharine Graham had died. And so that solicited a story that we create almost a lottery system where the 10 richest people in the city are all put on notice that if we can't make ends meet, we're coming for you. I guess you had to be there.
Speaking morbid, one of the arguments for the tax that I've made is that rich people just die. David Koch, fairly conservative guy, just died in New York. Why? Because he just died. He was planning on it, and he just died. And so then you owe the tax. But there is some idea of competition and movement that it create in and out. So that's an argument for at least raising the threshold to exempt more people. The reason you would not do it is because, again, we're talking about roughly like 1.7% of estates in DC are affected by this. This is by definition, it is a very small, extremely wealthy group of people that are even like at that threshold of possibly paying this. Again, it raised 48 million in 22. If we were to raise the exemption to something like 525 or 7 million, going past previous estimates, you're talking about roughly $2 million, $4 million to move that threshold amount. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Well, one of the things that this raised for me is that fact that we didn't actually, I don't think we ever discussed the proposal going the other direction that would actually lower the threshold. And I'm not sure why that didn't happen.
Why don't we make this a discussion of whether to lower it or raise it? So
Okay.
why should we lower it?
I mean, you know, like we talked about with the capital gains tax, very little wealth gets taxed in the United States. This is one of a couple of tools that we have for getting at wealth that, even though it is often sort of tied up in assets, is used to leverage things like loans and lines of credit and other things for income that folks get to use. So it is a form of income, and we're not taxing it. Whereas, you know, if you're a person who works day to day in a 9-to-5 job, for whatever your salary is, you're going to pay income tax every year on that money. And we will look at all of it, right? And we will tax it in different ways. So I don't see why we would do this. The other thing I'll just note is that, you know, yes, we bumped it to 525. Then the federal government, you know, blew a hole in this tax and raised the exemption to 11 million for singles, 22 for married couples. And we brought ours back down, we decoupled, and then council came together just like a couple years ago and said, actually, we should lower it to 4 million.
21.
So, was it, well, for the FY21 budget, but yeah, anyway. So, like that just happened, so we're literally gonna go back to council with this and say, let's bump it back to where it was. I mean, they just decided.
I think it's really important for competitiveness. I heard somebody testify that millionaires don't move from New Jersey to Florida, but I think there's no question millionaires move across a bridge 15 minutes away. And I don't know what the right number is, but I think if we are interested in competitiveness, this is something we should at least look at. Because I do think this is on a lot of people's minds. And I think there was a lot of discussion when the council moved it. To me, it doesn't seem like it raises that much money, but again, if you want to talk about competitiveness, this is something that could be out there.
Could we, I'm sorry, Jody, are you done? Could we, if the current number is the 4.28, one option is just to not touch it. That's one option. You know, and another option is to, you know, rather than go up to a 5.25 or a 7 million, that would be an adjusted inflation. If you could propose just an inflation adjusted amount based on the 4.5 going forward.
I'm pretty sure it is. I might not have included that information, but I
well, then
believe
if it is
I
adjusted,
apologize, yeah, I believe it
all right,
is.
well, that seems reasonable.
Yeah.
That growth grows
Double
by
check that, but I
inflation,
think so.
and that, well, look,
Yeah.
at some level, I think there's value in stability instead of this constant back and forth for estate planning purposes. So whatever it is, let's just lock it in so people aren't running to their estate lawyers every time the council meets.
I mean, we had a threshold of $1 million for a really long time, and including after federal tax reform under George W. Bush, that eliminated the federal credit. And, you know, I didn't see any evidence in the 2013 Commission's report about that having caused issues in terms of people moving, like nothing rooted in data or evidence, which I think is what we're trying to shoot for here. And we had that for years, right? And so I don't think there is a lot of evidence out there of the estate tax causing people to make interstate moves. And I also, want to just note that you have in here that the exemption for Maryland is 5 million, but they also have a flat rate on that. That's 16% for all of it, whereas ours is kind of a graduated rate.
So I think,
That probably washes out any difference.
so I think a couple of things. One, because the council did or didn't do something I think should not be, it should be informative to us and significant, but it's not determinative in my view, reception commission, that's number one. Number two, I think we need to take a broader view of the, against the cost of this, which is relatively modest, because we're only collecting 50 million. Think of the benefit. When we think of the benefit of this, we need to think of if someone moves to Virginia, we're not just losing their estate tax, we're losing their income tax present value for whatever number of years they have moved to Virginia. And that needs to be calculated. So that's number two. And number three, this is, to me, a great example of, for a relatively small cost, sending a signal that we want people with wealth to be here and pay, a huge percent of the budget are paid by rich people. That's a fact, and we need them here to do all the things we want to do.
Again, I think you can't just say people are gonna move. Like, where's the evidence that people are gonna move?
Well, we
Where's the
certainly
evidence?
have evidence that we're on a city without a growing population anymore. And we do have evidence that we are no longer growing. And the growth rate that we do have is thanks to birth rate. So there are people are leaving this city.
I guess what I would say is,
At all income levels.
Yeah.
what I would
I
say,
mean, that's,
what I would say is if you have a tax where it is going to cost you a lot of money, I could see where you really need to drill down and do some real conclusive data. But if you've got a tax where you can send a signal, and it's not really costing you that much, why not, for the benefit of the doubt, send that signal to taxpayers you need to pay the freight?
sure, this is not a popular tax across the US. Many states don't have it, right? And many states got rid of it in recent years. Do you know the reasoning for that?
Okay, so reasoning is something Erica brought up, which is that previously there used to be a credit where basically states could do this for free because you would pay the state estate tax, but that would get refunded to your federal, or it would come off your federal taxes. So in 2000, all 50 states in the district had an estate tax. The Bush tax cuts yanked it out. And then, I don't want to get this wrong because it's confusing, but basically it was something where because the estate taxes were tied to that credit, if the state did nothing, their estate tax went away. And so it was a really easy political lift for conservative states because it wasn't like they had to even pass a law saying we're for getting rid of our estate tax. They just took their hands off the wheel and it went away. And so it was actually for the more left-leaning progressive states that said, no, we still want this to be a part of our code. And so that's why you see roughly 13 to 15 states with it, and they're exactly the states you would imagine that still have it. Does that get?
Yeah. I would say, though, that the folks who will pay the estate tax in DC will no longer, whereas before they would have paid federal estate tax at a much lower level and on a lot more of their wealth, they now no longer have that obligation because the exemption is 11 million if you're single, 22 million if you're married. And so, they're still paying less.
So if you have a five or if it's a $7 million estate, currently you are paying less in total federal and state estate taxes than you would have previously. But that's because the federal changes, which are set to expire, which we don't know what Congress will do with them.
And our own changes.
And our own changes. So
This is a volatile source of revenue that's paid for by a few people.
yes.
I thought Mayor Williams' comments were right on, and I would associate myself with that, but I just wonder, if we do want to send a signal to that group of people, is this one of the top 3 or 4 ways to do it? It's a narrow group of people, as opposed to people who are high-income earners in their 30s and 40s, whom we want to have stay for 30 to 40 years. These people are making these decisions, I think, relatively late in life, and they're already here. So is that the yield that we want versus tax relief for everybody for 30 years of their life at age 30? So is this, if you want to send that signal, where would you rank this of all the tax relief that we can provide?
Also, is there someone, for example, someone who specializes in estate planning that we can reach out to and get some comments on how much this factors into the decisions of the folks that they're working with? Like practitioner, is there a practitioner that can tell us something?
Possibly. I feel like it's kind of like a selective audience because all their clients are really rich guys who are like, this tax
But
sucks.
there's all the people who pay it are really rich people. So
Yeah.
if we're actually lowering it, we're expanding it on to people who are not as wealthy. And I don't know what the appropriate limit is. If it's $1 million, you're capturing a lot of home values, for example.
Small business.
Probably
Yeah.
not a good limit, but no.
I mean, $1 million, whenever we changed it, wouldn't be $1 million in, I can forget.
So you're going to, so if the very rich are planning, again, I don't know, like this sounds speculative right now. I would rather hear the feedback from someone who actually does this work on the ground and see what they have to tell us.
But like a person in $1 million house probably isn't passing on $1 million in their estate to their estate flag up, but that's probably not what's happening.
Small businesses, Erica, that would get captured in $1 million. And so I'm thinking of, I use this reference, a point of reference, because it's a national city treasure. When, God forbid, no time soon, Virginia Ali were to pass away, that family business, that legacy, is worth more than $1 million. And it would be her hope, and I would think she has earned that right, to give that business to her children intact, not being forced to sell it to pay the taxes. I think there's a violence to that, requiring a person in a family that's invested their lives in the city to have to sell their property simply because of the tragedy of her passing on. That's why I'm open to the comment about, can we learn more? And then, what is that right number? That's all.
Taxing wealthy estates is not akin to violence.
No, but it is a violent act. It is, just disagree. I think taking something that has been in a family for generations, where they stayed through terrible times to provide a service and employment to the community, and telling that family, because your mother died, we're going to take this business from you, that is often the case. I think that is a form of violence, and you and I are just going to have to respectfully agree. I respect what you think. Please understand that's how I think.
Any other comments on this? How do we settle this?
Okay. Great transition into create a tax credit for income buyers, and to specify this would be creating an individual income tax credit that would in some ways at least be modeled or inspired by a previous version where DC first-time home buyers had a credit that was for 2011. So this would create a new credit on the income tax, but basically there I'm going to draw the line, and this is now where like your imaginations can run wild. It could be for anyone who buys their first home in DC, or it could be for someone who is buying their very first home, no other homes purchased, and it is in DC. It could be $5,000, $10,000 more. It could be available to households earning below any threshold, 100, 200, 500, 1 million or more. It can be phased out. It can be delivered in one lump sum, or you could say you are able to use this to lower your tax bill over the course of numerous years to allow people to spread out those payments. The reason you would create something like this is because you would hope that it would encourage, again, depending on how you designed it, current residents to buy a home in the district, or to possibly attract people from other jurisdictions to buy homes in the district. And you would also try to, it would hopefully provide more, it would be larger. By using the income tax, you provide a larger credit than you would if you only use the current tools that DC does, which are typically through the deed and recordation taxes and the special tax rate. The reason you would not want to do this is because we just don't have good information that this would incentivize homeownership. The test that we like to run is like, for all tax incentives, would this activity have happened if it didn't exist? And it would be very hard to say whether someone who has to have the wealth and the income to purchase a home would have gone through all that or would not have gone through all that just because the credit existed. Further, the benefit of using it on the income tax is that you can make it bigger. The problem is that you've got to wait. So you file income taxes in the spring. So hypothetically, let's say this credit exists and it's now March of 2025 and you purchase a home. Great. You will not see the benefit until spring of 26 when you file. And so it's not a way, unlike, to inject cash into the process. One of the benefits of the deed recordation tax for creating a special lower rate is that that's immediately a point of transaction. In income tax, you can go bigger, you can go more targeted, but it's more delayed, and then that gets into, is this tax incentivizing homeownership, or is it benefiting people who would have already made this decision? We do not have a revenue score for this. We think, based on the fact that there were 4,194 first-time home buyers, income tax could cost about $21 million. Again, it just completely depends on how big you design it, the way that would go up or down. And I'll turn it over with that.
There is a home purchase, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There is a home purchase assistance program that's rather strong and successful. I would imagine doing this through that grant program rather than an income tax credit makes more sense. And actually, as we're talking about that, even though that program has some unintended consequences that the city should think through. For example, while we are vetting those who are qualifying for these credits or grants, we're not vetting the type of buildings or units that they're buying. A lot of them buy, for example, condos in buildings that are under-resourced. The condo fees start going up really fast and they feel the burden. So I think doing it through the grant side, but even recommending that we strengthen that program would be meaningful. I wouldn't want to do it through the income tax credit.
I agree.
And just note too, this I think was fairly popular and thought of as successful when it was a federal tax way back when. But also note, I think real estate was probably a quarter as expensive as it is now. I just don't know if $5,000 is a meaningful amount when the average price of a home is what, in the mid 200s? I don't know.
The average home price here is over $1 million. The median is lower.
So, and I know there'd be income means to it. And back then, the city wasn't a proven place to live. It wasn't a great place. People weren't flocking here anyway, like they did for the last 20 years without this tax. So I just don't know whether it's the right target and the right outcome now, as opposed to other things we could do for the middle class, like a child tax credit and stuff.
Wait, couldn't this be the wealth creation legacy initiative? I do think that $2,000 tax credit way back when inspired a lot of people to want to buy it. I personally, know folks who used it, and it was it could have been a 50-50 decision to put them over the top. No one would do that for $2,000 today. A program.
I think it was 5.
I'm not saying 2, but 5.
The federal tax is 5.
But whatever the amount that would be right-sized, you could give it to a particular income category, the middle income. You could put a requirement that there be a certain number of years of residency requirement before you're eligible. And therefore, these are people who have invested in the city as renters or for a period of time. Presumably, they paid into the treasury, and it's simply us returning that investment to them. I do think the crime situation is causing people to doubt and have second thoughts about these large investments. Might be worth thinking about how do we incentivize people to come back. But how, what other tool do we have? Just one second.
I disagree with that, David.
Right.
Sorry, are you finished?
One second.
Okay, go ahead.
That wealth creation, home ownership is a great avenue for it. And so whether it's eliminating the deed or recordation tax, or whether it's some form of this or a combination of the two, something that says to the broad middle class, especially with a residency requirement, we're going to return some of this investment to you for purposes of. Anyway, I'm sorry, yes, should I finish?
Oh, no, this is perfect. I see your point, but I think programs like this will make only a marginal impact on wealth creation. I'd rather see a tax regime that raises as much revenue as possible without causing many dislocation and disruptions, and use the revenue to invest in reducing crime, invest in education. So that's, to me, that's a much more meaningful way of going at it. It's just a marginal thing. It'll make us feel good, but I don't think it's gonna have a big impact. That's my
I hear you. Okay.
The room across the hall is available if we want to get away from this van, because security, if we want to up and move, it would be a little bit of a procedure to, but we can make that our mid-meeting break.
Yeah, we could do that. I think that'd be good. This is ridiculous. I feel like we're at the bowling wind tournament.
Yeah. Should we do that now, and then we'll just take our break a little early? All right, so we'll reconvene at 25 after.
That's more important.
Do we just dial back into this number or what happens?
You can just stay on, or you can.
Okay. Okay, I'll just stay on.
We're recording. Let me switch to Al. Hang on. Yeah, we're recording. Okay. All right, good. Welcome back. Much quieter in here. So we've got 4 additional proposals in the memo that I sent out on Wednesday that we're going to talk through. Let me say a few remarks about. I think it'll be helpful to have a conversation about all 4 of them together. So I'd like to walk through all 4 of them, and then we can have a group conversation about all of them. And you'll notice that they bear some resemblance to the email that David sent out, although in building them out, all responsibility is on staff, and David may or may not agree with the way we built them out a little bit. They are all, what they have in common is that they are all targeted tax incentives, targeted in one way or the other. The first one is targeted by geography, as well as by type of investment. The second one is targeted to specifically local investments, to loans and grants to startups, new and emerging businesses. The third one is targeted based on employee circumstances, particularly to historically disadvantaged or marginalized workers. The fourth one is targeted to new folks coming into the district anew, new investors. Conceptually, there's a strong argument to get economic development to places where the normal market just isn't functioning the way we want it to, which is them leaving capacity on the table, as witnessed by high unemployment rates or underutilization of infrastructure or capital resources. The downside of them generally is that there's not a great base, and I should say economic development professionals like having these tools to offer to businesses to attract them to a jurisdiction. The downside is there's typically not a strong base of rigorous research and analysis that supports the investment, mostly because to the extent that they're associated with positive outcomes, it can be really hard to prove that those outcomes work anyway, and they're not necessarily better than direct spending programs. So let me touch briefly on each of the four. The M10 is an east of the river transformation zone. Right now, DC does not have a broad program of tax incentives east of the Anacostia River. I should note that DC does have an opportunity zone program. This is based on a federal program of the same name that was created in the 2007 tax law. In DC, that's working in 25 distinct census tracts. 17 of them are east of the river. Maryland and Virginia both have sort of zone-based programs, although Virginia's program is grant, not tax credits. And so the proposal is to create a zone east of the river that would include refundable credits based on, particularly focusing on social determinants of health, as well as facade improvements, capital expenditures, lower corporate tax rates. The reasons you would do this, this is to target promote economic activity in the part of the city where it's most needed. The research does suggest that if you're going to do this, you do it in a place where it's most needed, and certainly Ward 7 and 8 have by far the highest unemployment rates in the district. They also have the worst health outcomes by many measures. Again, the arguments against is it as well targeted as it could be, and DC does have currently an opportunity zone program as well as some programs on the spending side of the budget that support businesses. The second one, proposal M11, access to capital. I think that the suggestion was, how do we provide tax subsidies for grants or below market loans or equity investments? We interpret this as being a suggestion that we invest in community development financial institutions, which are private entities, mission-based entities that are investing, that are with a mission to promote economic development by providing products and services in traditionally underserved communities. And we could do that through a number of different tax subsidies for grants or loans to CDFIs. Again, the arguments against those, for doing so, is that there certainly are communities that are underserved by capital, where capital is hard to access for particular communities. The argument against is that there already are a number of things happening in the district through on-budget programs that are supporting entities like that. Employment and job training programs. There is something called the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which DC administers. It's a federal credit, but DOES administers it, and it's for employers hiring individuals from groups including TANF and SNAP recipients, veterans, ex-felons, and certain other groups. So the idea would be to piggyback, either piggyback on the federal credit or create a new additional credit for certain groups that would be applicable against DC taxes. Maryland, Virginia, Maryland, other states like California have various similar credits for employment and for training. This could help employers offset the costs of so doing. And ideally, it would, by encouraging folks who are participating in public assistance programs, by giving them opportunities to enter into the workforce, could potentially down the road save money on the cost of assistance. The arguments against, we do already have a federal work opportunity tax credit, and the research on the federal work opportunity tax credit is not great, showing its impact on long-term employment perspective. It does help get people into the workforce, but whether they stay in the workforce is less clear. And part of the reason is that it appears that a lot of the subsidies go to employers with a lot of turnover, like temp agencies. And finally, the tax incentives for investors to move to DC. So this is an idea based on a program in Puerto Rico known as Act 2022, which was later rolled into another broader package of tax incentives called Act 60. You'll sometimes see it referred to that way. And it's very generous. It exempts certain new residents who make certain kinds of investments from income and property and capital gains taxes to a large degree for their first 15 years. It has had a significant impact in Puerto Rico. You can really see the difference. A lot of investors have located there, purchased property, established residence. It's also, it has probably, for that reason, it's very reasonable to think that it has had a lot of spillover effect in terms of job creation. On the other side, it's also come in for a lot of criticism. It's quite expensive. The loss of tax revenue is high. It has the folks who have come in have essentially pushed out current residents. It's not clear that Puerto Rico is a great model for it. You can see there are a lot of differences. People in Puerto Rico don't pay federal income tax, so when you exempt them from Puerto Rico income tax, you're going from 34% down to as far as 0. That's different from thinking about DC's 10.75% top rate. So I'll stop there. We have some rough revenue estimates for the impacts of here, but none of these have formally been reviewed by ORA.
Nick, can I ask just a qualifying, about the Puerto Rico Act? Does it have any regulation or requirement to hire local?
I believe so. There is an individual part of this broader Act 60 has a lot of, it sort of is all their different economic development incentives, and they have a lot of business tax incentives that are sort of more standard business tax incentives, and I think that some of them do have local hiring requirements. The requirement to the part of the Act 22, which is the most controversial part, to encourage people to move there, does not, to my knowledge, have a local hiring requirement.
I would be very interested in learning more about the Puerto Rico Act, because I think there is no question that it has incentivized business development in Puerto Rico. I do think that will be proven out, and we should know that. But I am also, and I think in the city, we need businesses in the city. We need jobs, but I would be really interested in learning more about this, but also pairing it with a requirement for training of local residents. And I don't know, I need somebody else to tell me sort of the right percentage of hire local. Is that 5%? Is that 25%? Is that 30%? I'm not sure. But I do think there should be some hire local requirement for anything like this, because I think as we think about what we're trying to incentivize and creating a larger group that's participating in taxes, I think that comes both first with jobs and companies, and second with people who live here. And I'm very interested in educating and creating a stronger workforce.
So I would say, first thing is, this is part of our work on competitiveness. Where do we stand on the evaluation, just as a process? Where do we stand on the evaluation, not just of competitiveness writ large, but a subset of that, incentives? That's number one. Number two, the districts, this is my opinion, obviously, all jurisdictions are not created equally. Some jurisdictions, incentives work very, very powerfully, and in other jurisdictions, they just fall flat. In the district, they work very, very powerfully. The metro station over at Noma, powerful incentive. The Southwest Waterfront, we were collecting $9 million. We put $9 million in. We collect $100 million now. The incentives work very, very powerfully if you have a setting like DC, which was and could once again be a very powerful demand economy, in my view. When you say there's a net loss of revenue from an incentive, my view is always, if you weren't raising anything anyway, how can you say the incentive represented a loss? You weren't collecting any taxes anyway. Was it a loss because now these folks are taking services that we didn't have to provide before? Maybe, but I would be very, very careful with saying there was lost revenue. And lastly, there is a very deep relationship to Puerto Rico in that the district, like Puerto Rico, has no representation. Now, Puerto Rico has no federal tax. However, whatever you think of it, the Congress's, the federal government's acknowledgement that they don't have representation. We've been going the statehood route, but while we're going the statehood route, we should constantly remind Congress that we don't have any representation, number one. You just basically are in the you're in the process of essentially implementing the largest base closing in American history. You should help us. And the argument is you could use part of that help for some incentives like this. And I think to David's package, a lot of this is about that. To David's package, I think that one of the things we should think about, as we have with the rest of the code, how could we productively and competitively leverage the opportunity zones? I mean, they're here, they're being used, they're having an impact. Are there ways that we could leverage or piggyback the federal opportunity zones with our own recipe? So just some thoughts. Go ahead.
Mayor, just if I could, on the East of the River Economic Transformation Zone, Nick, you're right, there is an opportunity zone program. We had the opportunity to work on these programs for 3 years, including the largest investments in the district on Capitol Hill East. And this was through EJF Capital, and Mayor, you will know about EJF. What was fascinating about the opportunity zones, which is a terrific idea, but it's the use of cumulated capital gains and the use of those cumulated capital gains to make investments in a very narrow group of eligible investments. So it's not everything. So you've got rich funds who are looking for big projects that are mostly housing, et cetera, not commercial corridors, for instance. There are huge limitations on the effectiveness, although it is great for big projects. So I don't want to diminish it. I just want to acknowledge its limitations. What I'm thinking about, and I'm sorry if this didn't come across, Nick, is I'm looking at a continuum of what we do to transform, as the name suggests, wards that have historically had underinvestment. So right now we have 2 fantastic accelerators in east of the river. One is Sycamore and Oak, that's funded by the Emerson Foundation. The other is Ward Infinity, funded by Johns Hopkins. But we don't have a good incubator system, we have a good accelerator program. What we need is a continuum from ideas to stand up to success, the transformation into the community. Once you have a business idea, how do you help that business succeed in retail corridors in the communities that we are going, all right? So what are those incentives like to help the businesses who go through an incubator, an accelerator, and show up on Minnesota Avenue or Good Hope Road or whatever to survive or succeed? And that's why I was looking at refundable tax credits to be the next stage of capital to help them, all right? Looking at ways to privilege the employment of people in the neighborhood and helping those businesses simultaneously through refundable tax credits for training and for wages. Looking at refundable tax credits for facade issues because we want the neighborhood to look in a presentable, respectful way that contributes to public safety. And I also think we should consider either a lower commercial tax or a lower property tax, commercial property tax for these entities. In other words, create a thoughtful beginning soup to nut system that helps organic businesses from the community thrive. That's what I'm, to the mayor's point, the amount we collect in these communities for these purposes is next to nothing. There's no big fiscal impact. So investing in this, there's only an upside.
So but to get you're saying, this will pick up on so there are existing companies that are in danger, that would be danger of going through like capital starvation, let's say, but for initiatives like this, right?
Right. So what you have is you've got, I encourage folks to learn about Sycamore and Oak, to learn about Ward Infinity, to learn about these, and these are either retail in the case of Sycamore and Oak or social determinant of health businesses with Ward Infinity, that they have great ideas. We have had some super successes. Market 7 is one. But how do you, once you get them at graduation, how do you make sure they have the capital to take the next steps and create thriving businesses? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, just continue the conversation, yeah.
Can somebody remind me, so the district did something along the Puerto Rico thing. We did that, there was a program whereby Living Social got a lot of benefits, and then we had an act for tech companies. So how did were they successful?
I think the Living Social incentive was structured so that they would only be eligible for the credits if they could meet the hiring goals. The company came to an end before it could even reach those things. So in some ways, that's sort of like contingent on success. Although they were not successful, they didn't get the money.
Yeah, they were not able to hire enough local people.
They were not able to, or they expired prior to time?
Also, they started folding. I mean, the whole group of
It was a struggle. I remember it was a struggle. I talked to the tuition about it.
And what about the tech companies incentives?
So this, David, maybe you can talk to this much
Right.
more authoritatively than I can. So this is your baby, so to speak.
So 25 years ago, we started researching what the incentives might be like to create a clean economy based on technology in the district. So we had roundtables of folks who were involved. Some we got right, some we didn't. And the idea was to try to leverage these companies that had this, on the wage credit section, trying to leverage companies that have historically not had broad diversity in their workforce to add additional incentives through relocation tax credits. We wanted the companies to move here, but once here, we wanted them to hire hard-to-employ individuals and get them in on the ground floor. All right, we did certain corrections, certain reductions on personal property tax, on complete tax breaks for buildings. If they located, they would have a 0% commercial property tax. If they were a majority of the building, there was a 6% tax on profits, which of course for many of these companies who don't make money is a modest. The real thing we didn't do would be a capital gains reduction, so that if you did make it, you wouldn't have all your money taxed away. Look, but what we didn't do was tend the garden. If I'm honest, there was some less than helpful administrative early on in its adoption. The CFO's office was not a fan of it, and so they served as a gatekeeper for who could be certified as a qualified company. So you would have people in line waiting to be certified who never got certified, and so it was stillborn. And then we claimed
Did it
didn't
lapse?
work.
Did the program lapse, or what did?
Well, it was unfunded, in part by the council a couple of years ago, and we redistributed the money to other purposes. And this is the example I gave you of the company that we brought to the district, Starship, which is the world's leading autonomous delivery service. When we put the headquarters of that company on 16th.
Sorry, we is who, sorry?
Like Starship. So I'm worked for them for years. I have an equity stake in it, whatever. We brought the company here. The founders were the Skype founders, Ati Halen and Janis Fries. We started when the company had employees you could fit in this room. We had 34 employees on 16th and P. And the council decided, they knew better about this qualified tech company. That company went from like 34 employees to 1,000. But as soon as that whole organism was dismantled, and we were majority minority workforce in this city, was working exactly as I had wanted it to. The city dismantled it, and they moved across the river. And the employees weren't able necessarily to follow. All right, and so was it a perfect system? No. That company was in the process of figuring out how to apply for these, and then by that time it was over and it was gone. It was not a perfect program. Okay.
Nothing is, right?
But it got people's attention.
I mean, I'm wondering how much, and I don't know, somebody in here may know if we have any evaluations of opportunity zones and whether they've had the intended impact.
I'm not aware.
Okay. So, I mean, I just think doubling down on things where we don't actually have evidence is, maybe not, shouldn't rise to the top of our priorities. I also, I think that some of the things that are discussed in some of these proposals are things that DEMPED does through some of its own grant and loan programs. So, I mean, it'd just be, I think, worthwhile if we're actually gonna spend time thinking or considering these to see like where we're already basically investing those dollars, where we already have a tool that is being used to do the same things. Because I don't know why we would, create a set of tax incentives when we already have something that's up and running that we could expand or modify if we think it needs to be changed. We don't need to recreate wheels.
My only thought about this is, this is where I live, and I agree. I think there doesn't need to be necessarily anything duplicative if we have extant systems. However, I think the kind of disinvestment this East of the River has experienced over its lifetime requires risk-taking and addition of zones to get economic activity there, encourage residents to get involved there, encourage businesses to get there. So my only thing would be, yes, we can examine, if we're gonna wait to see how efficacious opportunity zones are before we do something else, I think that's one step. My thought is everything needs to be thrown east of the river, regardless of what's currently there. And that may not be the most proficient way to articulate it. But if there's anything that we can do to spur economic development east of the river, I'm in.
I really appreciate, I was reading last night, Mustafa Abdul Salam just gave me a copy of the Ward 8 Community Economic Development Report. And, they're definitely calling, through conversations with thousands of residents in Ward 8, they've come up with a policy agenda, including what kinds of investments they feel like are needed in small business. And it's like from my quick read last night, and I haven't dug into all the details, it sounds like they really want direct investment, because there are a lot of people in Ward 8 who could be entrepreneurs, who could be small business owners, likely aren't going to be eligible for a tax credit, but who need investment, right? And who need somebody to...
Why do you say that? Would not be eligible for a refundable tax credit?
You have to have tax liability first.
Well, I think we have evidence of these businesses succeeding right now in their accelerator state.
The kinds of businesses you're talking about, but I'm talking about like micro level.
What do you think Ward Infinity is? These are nearly 36 small businesses that come organically from the community. That's what Sycamore and Oak is all about. Actually facilitating the initiation of locals in the retail space in the community, giving the people the chance to graduate from these programs to a real business. And I'll only say, we've been involved in this since 2018. The level of sophistication, getting folks ready to run a business is one thing. Getting them prepared to navigate the DMPED bureaucracy to find out when and how this money comes, and is it enough, and will it fill? Maybe in a perfect world, but why not simply have the benefits readily accessible and educate folks on them and let them take advantage of them on their time frame? Not an RFP process through the government.
I don't know that on a tax timetable is necessarily getting people cash when they need it, but I still think that your tax liability will be what determines the kind of benefit you get. And so like for folks who just don't have much tax liability, for businesses that don't, a grant program is probably going to be more useful than a tax credit.
The refundable credit for wages paid, refundable credit for training endured, lower commercial property tax, refundable credits for facade improvements. Businesses are, in addition, if you'll just bear with me, these community development investment banks are a great opportunity for us to bring money from New York and put them in the community development banks in the city who I believe are in a better position, no offense to our deputy mayor's administration, the people who live and work and lend every day of the week in the neighborhoods, the industrial banks on Benning Road, know more about creditworthy and what's going on, respectfully, than a revolving door at DIMPED. Importing money, giving them a broader license, letting us bear the risk, and investing the money in the communities, letting these small, businesses appear in front of these lenders with our money to invest in the neighborhood and set them up to succeed. Maybe it's beyond the scope, but I just don't think the solution is DIMPED, with all due respect. And that's why I put this forward. Let me just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an administrative aspect to what you're saying. Right, continuity of government, it's less subject to, let me take that argument. Other points any people have on this one? People would like to make?
So I think that, just from a staff perspective, I'll say, if DIMPED is not going to be involved in sort of designing what this looks like and administering and certifying. In some places, you have to go certificate to get any kind of incentive for that. In others, it's just essentially by right. I think then that really puts the pressure on, from a design perspective, to design it in a way that really gets at who you want to get at it, as opposed to because otherwise you run into the problem that the research has found is pretty common, is sort of leakage to a lot of other populations, folks coming in from other parts of the city. So I think if we were to turn this into something concrete that would be like an actual value add to the policy conversation, how would you suggest a way of going forward to sort of fight? Because you put out a lot of really interesting and stimulating ideas, and I'm struggling in my head to think about how do we turn it into something that maintains a level of accountability and concreteness that will really grab the attention of policymakers.
Just as a thought, if we, and this is maybe a subject for another round here, but if the district, and I don't want the CFO to stroke out here, but if we were to bring some of our New York funds back, invest them in district CDFIs, our CDFIs are very undercapitalized. They don't have the money to loan out. And you cannot go from Ward 7 and 8 across town. I mean, yes, Morgan Stanley and they have certain programs for the district as an offset to give them the privilege of banking here, but that money isn't the same as having, and I'll use industrial as an example of a bank that knows the community, doubling, or maybe that's too aggressive, a 30 or 40% increase in their available capital for purposes of loans, where we understand and explain what our tolerance is for loss. They seem to be the best executors of loans than a government agency. They know the communities, they know they have a system that could be, and then it's about, Nick, how do we make sure that those funds go to the people we want? And I'll speak for myself. I would like those funds to go to people who live in the community, who are starting businesses. And then I want to use the tax code to do everything we can to set them up to succeed. That's it. And I'm agnostic about which ones we use, whether it's the refundable wage and training credit, which I think would be valuable, whether it's facade improvement, because I think there's a public safety angle, whether it's a zero interest loan from one of these companies to have access to capital to start a lease and to open their business. This is pennies on the dollar of what we spend right now.
Maybe one way to think about, I'm sorry. One way to think about it is that DIMPED is the right group for making the grants that they're already making. They're directly supporting small businesses. Yeah, and it's a policy direction and a political decision that the council and the mayor makes in terms of who is going to get this, but it's like at a smaller level, it seems like it's appropriate. But maybe thinking about where these incentives, if they are having an impact, where might they have the greatest impact. I can think of incubators as, so they kind of raise venture capital, they invest in a bunch of small businesses, and one of them gets sold, they cash out, that's great, right? And everybody has something, they actually provide the training. So maybe having some sort of talking to incubators that do this, I don't know, like, people, maybe the other group to talk to would be Union Kitchen, because that's what they do, to see what is it that they need in terms of incentives, or what would be valuable to them.
So Dan Tingerlini, who we all know well, runs the Emerson Collective, and this Sycamore and Oak is his pet project. They just opened a fantastic facility. That's one idea. The folks from Word Infinity, not to, in all fairness, I represent Johns Hopkins. This is a pet project of ours. We're working with foundations to try to fund those $30,000 grants that help businesses actually prove the concept, but we get them to graduation, and then what? That's what I'm looking for help solving.
I have a question. Can a regime of breaks that think about a life cycle of a firm starting, whether you're concentrating on physical development or employment, can it be dynamic enough to react to economic changes? So you're talking to someone who's administered taxes for 20 years, we're really slow. And what makes sense today? I don't know. And I'm not saying no.
The regulatory process be rather than through law, the regulatory process that allows for nimble rulemaking for changing. In other words, the legislation could set forth, these are the 6 potential, incentives or whatever, and then make them subject to rulemaking. And then the rulemaking can be much more nimble, because you can have that has some governance issues, but it does give you real time. By your office, as long as you're living within a certain fixated amount.
Joey's room.
Can you mute yourself?
And I have to watch if she wants to actually comment.
Okay, any more on this? Good discussion on this, okay? Woman agent?
All right, thank you. So the next thought I had was to open up this space for conversation.
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't mean, I just followed this whole thing, but where are we leaving this group, Nick? Because these feel so broad to me, this group we just went through. And I certainly am interested in learning a lot more about the Puerto Rico Act and how it would impact. And I don't know if we're just leaving this at we're going to get back to it, or what's our next step on this group we just went through?
So I think we have a couple of options. Certainly, we can put together a package of material on how Puerto Rico's Act 22 has worked, and point you to some materials put forward by its advocates and also the folks that raise concerns. I do have a concern about design. It's connected a little bit to the point Glenn just made about how do we design something in real time that is responsive to needs, that as I hear it saying, there's concern about sort of DMPED making decisions, but then you have to have somebody writing these regulations. I'm not sure if that's a CFO. So I'm struggling in my own head to think about what this looks like in the context of a recommendation, and to what extent does this body dive into the nitty-gritty details versus to what extent does this body say, hey, here's the general strategy we think should be pursued. Here's sort of the amount in this overall package of recommendations. Here's the amount of money it might take, and then
I certainly would like to slow down to study this, to understand more. And I'm not sure that we're the ones who write it, but I don't know enough to understand it right now. And when I think about the long ball for DC, there is no question in my mind that we have to think how to create a more expansive tax base here. And this is something that has proven to do that somewhere else. So I think at a minimum, it is our responsibility to learn more about this. And if that means we have to slow down and we don't meet a time frame that I'm not sure what I would just say, I am one who says we need to slow down. That is our responsibility, because this is one of the few proposals that I've seen that really talks about how we can expand a tax base in a meaningful way. I don't know if I was just cut off.
City.
Sorry, I might have just been cut off, but this is one of the few that I've seen that in really a meaningful way can do something for this city that I personally, and I've said this multiple times, I really worry about the direction we're headed. And so whether or not it's the replication of what they've done in Puerto Rico, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we should look at, but I think we need to slow down and study things like this.
So I think it's important to know, for the Puerto Rico example, there are two profound differences between us and them. The federal tax and their current marginal tax that they're being relieved from is dramatically higher than ours, like 5 times as much. So the impetus to move there is a much greater impact than it is to move here. And you know, we've just talked about 2 initiatives that roughly equate to something like this: the Living Social and the tech stuff. And we didn't really, like, none of them exist yet, and we don't really have a success story. I mean, can somebody talk about anything we've done in the last 20 years similar to this here that's worked, that survived, that was successful, that didn't lapse or wasn't defunded or didn't go out of business? Like, because we have tried this before here in the city. And have any of them succeeded?
Well, Greg, I would say we could have a discussion on the New Economy Transformation Act and the tech incentives. There were a number of companies that did participate and who did come to the district. CoStar was one of them. They moved to the district because of that law, period. There were others. We never championed, highlighted, emphasized, or made it easy, okay? That there's also an issue of talent. So, you know, tech companies require a certain software engineering talent, for instance. We don't necessarily have a natural reservoir here. So let's set that aside here. I want to revisit, if we're going to think about the themes of the recommendations, going back to a collection of incentives to incentivize small businesses and in these communities east of the river, commercial corridors, et cetera, individual business owners, et cetera, how we might do that, I think could touch a lot of the council's bases of the 5 things they asked us to do. No?
Yes. To me, that's distinct from the Puerto Rico model. I mean, that's some of the other things we talked about before that. I get that, and I'm intrigued by those. The Puerto Rico model, to me, doesn't seem to be totally transferable for the reasons of scale and the federal, and they have a 34%, so they're being relieved of a 34% local tax rate when they come, as opposed to 8 here. That's a different incentive.
But you have to adjust that for that they don't have any federal.
Well, that makes the point even more.
No, I think it makes it less.
If they come here, they still pay federal.
What's the net? I think, to me, and I don't want to argue this because I think we should explore it further myself.
We've got to look at some big moves. If we're not willing to look, and they may not make sense, but if we're not at least willing to investigate them, what are we doing for the city? We're talking about creating small businesses, which which I am a proponent of, but we're talking about 1 and 2 jobs. We need to be talking about how are we going to make some radical impact in the city. And it is I feel like that's why I signed up to be on this commission. It's worth the time to me. And I think it's important that we at least give this some time to investigate.
Well, at some level, it's a moot point, because for the Puerto Rico model, the net fiscal impact is 0, right? Because these are places that people aren't currently here, correct? So at that rate, there's no skin off our back to propose it. But I just think we should be informed by what we've done in the past on this, and CoStar is an example of what we want to do. How long did their subsidies last, their incentives last, do you know?
The legislation, I mean, it's not as crisp in my mind as when I was younger, but there were limitations on how long the various benefits lasted. But on the Puerto Rico, which I'm intrigued, and I think there's no harm in looking at it more and learning more about it. I wonder if there are other incentives that Congress can give to us that have a 0 impact on the federal budget, because they would come and say, well, if they take a big haul out of the district. If we were to go to 0, that's going to be a statistically significant, presumably, for them. I wonder if there are things we can ask for that don't. I mean, the reshoring of financial services, insurance companies, and others. If we could make the district the Hamilton of the, you know what I mean? There are things that could be interesting there that would privilege us in the financial, in the insurance market. These are clean jobs with lots of, potential benefit. The feds could do that, and they might have an interest to reshore some of these companies to the U.S. Just a thought.
To me, I think, we have one side of the Congress going to be Republican for some time, and I think we should have an appeal that.
They might like that, they might.
Whatever that appeal is, I think we should try to get some kind of, just in general, them taking responsibility for our lack of representation and their custody of us, if you will. And 2, that again, they're in the process of enacting the biggest space closing ever, and they should help us. And the only way the Republicans are going to help us is with tax relief. The days of Republicans writing a check to me are long gone. That's just a fact, right? So
if we could make a deal with them, and the deal is we will reassume those, and this was a matter of personal self-respect as a jurisdiction, we could reassume some of the duties that the feds continue to pay, courts and so on. We have a hard time making a compelling case of self-determination as long as they're still paying a lot of our bills. Now, they don't pay their full freight on the property and the business activity here, so that's kind of a wash. But just for simplicity's sake, we want to be a state. We will reassume responsibility financially for these. These are the things you can do for us, and go from there.
Courts are really expensive.
It's $500 million at least.
Plus, you need to build a prison.
Yep.
And it had to be married with the commuter tax.
But these things have to happen anyway if we want to be a state. In other words, if we are going to have a full-throated, self-respecting statehood agenda.
But I'm just saying, short of that, I don't think the statehood thing's going to carry any water with them. I just think we need something short to moderate term to help us out and leave the statehood for another day. And I know I'm called the colonial governor. I'm just being realistic.
No argument here. Whatever you recommend.
You know what I mean? Yeah, but back to our point, I think there's a lot of feeling that we should explore this further and see what the, right?
I think we need to probably list out all the things we need to explore, because we keep talking about, let's explore this more, We need data and evidence on like everything we're gonna put in the package, and we're supposed to deliver something in December, and it's, November's next week. So I appreciate the idea that we should take time and investigate things, but this is coming, This is a proposal coming very late. We don't have a lot of time. We only have staff through March. And ideally, we're getting something that actually influences the mayor and, you know, has a chance of getting on the agenda with council. So we just don't have a lot of time.
Do we have staff until March? I would love to be brought up to speed on how all that works.
I think we have till February. I mean, the commission doesn't go dormant until February, so we have until February. You know, what I hope we could do is to have and Nick, if we could have a time frame that goes back. Let's assume we want to deliver these on February 1st. Let's assume we want to put these in the DC Register and let everyone comment. So that would be, you know, January 1st in the DC Register. If you give people 10 days to respond, gives us those 3 weeks or whatever to review and to make final determinations, or move it all up. We can have our final recommendations in the DC Register on the 15th of December, presumably. We can have their comments back by the 7th of January. We spend 3 weeks reviewing them, putting our final proposal together and get it to the council by the middle of February. We're good until the middle of February.
Oh, but the mayor's budget process is well underway by the middle of February. She's had town hall meetings by then, and I don't think her budget is very malleable to this extent by middle of February. It's too late.
Let me, if I could just please speak to the previous commission to give you an outline of how that worked, and then you can make your decisions with that information. In 2013, we made recommendations in December. When the recommendations were made, staff relieved a memo briefly explaining what was going on. In January and February, a little into March, Mayor Williams met with the current members of the council, then Mayor Gray, and the staff came along with him to have those meetings. The report was then written from January and then published in April, at which point the staff dissolved. So there was roughly 2 months of meetings with council and 3+ for writing the report.
During that process, what time of year did the equivalent of this meeting happen?
You were roughly on the schedule of the 2013 commission in that you have had introductory research, you've had deliberations on individuals, and you are now in October, early November, moving into the idea of a package. Obviously, voting and unanimous support is a hurdle, and you still have that length to go, but you are roughly on the trajectory of that commission. But the last step is, as always, kind of hardest.
Does it depend on who we want to be the champion of these proposals? In other words, if we don't get stuff to the mayor by February, that's too late for her for that upcoming fiscal year. You know, in other words, if we're going to show up and say, you know, if I'm the mayor, I wouldn't welcome that. I wouldn't welcome, you know, if I'm wrapping up my budget, Mr. Mayor, I'll defer to you, but if I'm wrapping up my deliberations sometime in February, and then all of a sudden this upsets apple carts, that's not helpful. What would be helpful is if we produced something thoughtful and got it in queue for the 26 budget, and let her consider the things that she would like or not in the budget, and then negotiate with the council at a council breakfast about which of these things can we live with or not. My fear is I don't want, in a timing perspective, jam the process. And I'm not suggesting that any staff member did this intentionally, or this is just the way it is. But I just think that's a little late for us if we want the mayor to be our champion.
How can we squeeze in, I mean, this, with due respect to staff who I, worked with before, I think they've done an excellent job, with due respect, we're the commission, so we get to decide what we want to do and how we do it. And if the commission wants to study further some issues where they feel unrequited or unsatisfied, how can we do that and still, the marker being, give the decision makers material for decision in an adequate amount of time for the 25 budget? We're talking about the 25 budget, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. Somebody said 26, but I think we're talking 25, yeah.
I was suggesting that we, if we deliver stuff in February, that if it upsets the budget apple cart that she has already produced, that could be a challenge. But I want to leave that aside. If we are trying to accomplish things in 25, the sooner the better. Then this has to be a council-focused advocacy, because she will mostly have been left out of the discussions.
So I think we just need to make, I think, personally, I think we can delve into some of these things. Area of competitiveness, area of incentives. Have we explored all the areas that broaden the base? That's what I'm hearing, to expand the base through stimulus and incentives. In the aggregate or micro, as David's saying, and I don't mean micro in a pejorative way. Can we do all that and give the mayor time to make decisions? I personally think we can.
Do we need to bring on additional resources to help us study some of these things?
Do we have the capacity to do that, or we have blown our budget?
In an ideal world, we have the district's purchasing process to deal with, and it takes a long time to get funds to a researcher to flesh out the area of sort of economic development incentives, whether it's direct spending or on the tax side, is a whole area of expertise. There are a lot of very knowledgeable people. We can start to pull some of them in. We can try to sort out some of these problems. I am a little worried about timeline, how fast we could turn this into something that would bear any resemblance to the concreteness of all the other proposals that we've talked about. And I think to some extent it does depend on commissioners' individual willingness to put the time in, and I know you all are super busy, but I'm very appreciative that I hear people saying they have a desire to dig in individually and figure out what works, what doesn't work, to the extent you can, it's going to be hard to sort of spend a lot of time putting things neatly on a silver platter for folks to consider, to set up briefings. To the extent that folks are willing to dig in themselves on their own time and do the reading on the materials that I can share, that will cut through it a lot. I think that will speed things up a lot. Becky, you want to jump in?
Can I just add one thing? We were going to do a stakeholder meeting with the tech folks, the DC Tech Council. It was organized, and then they canceled it last minute because they didn't want it to be on the record.
Right.
And we asked them to submit testimony. They never did.
We never heard from them, and then the staff guy went on paternity leave, I think.
So, under the current schedule, when did we first, so there's going to be some sharing of a draft for public comment. When did we anticipate sharing with the mayor and the council, even if it's just an executive summary of the report? What was that date? What is that
December.
Date? December,
December, whenever the commission comes to agreement.
I mean, there's a big difference between the 1st and 31st of December in this process. So, I mean.
Yes, but it's a holiday month too, so a lot of that time isn't real.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to pull.
So I think almost the worst case scenario would be to deliver the report in February, when it's too late to be, it'll be there, yet too late to be evaluated for the budget they're doing that month. So it seems to me it's either get it to them in early December or wait till after the budget process.
I think that's really important, because then both the mayor and the council will have equal opportunity to consider the package. Like if we shorten that time for the mayor, that's really not appropriate in my mind.
Mayor, if I might, what if we were to ask the chairman and the mayor, just ask, when would you like to see this for your own agenda items? I think that's a respectful thing to do. And then they tell us. And let's assume that they're like, well, we have 12 proposals, we might not be able to do all 12. 5 might be easy, slip them in the budget and off you go. 7 might be challenging. And so there would be a separate piece of legislation with the blessings of whomever that could go before the body, and they would have until the end of the year to resolve it. And hopefully that could serve as informing the next year's budget. I just don't know, I fear that if she feels like her back is against the wall, that might not solicit a lot of great, even if she were like the ideas, that she's put all this time in the budget, then these other things come, and it might unpixelate what she has herself put together. Glenn, do you have any insights into this that you can share about when pencils go down on the mayor's budget?
You're talking about the roughly right time frame. A package in February is close enough to when pencils are down where most of the decisions have been made. I have to say, you may not appreciate it, appreciate that every elected official in the DMC will be overwhelmed by the realities of the MUD. That will be very public on Tuesday. It already is public. It was clear, the board hearing. How the district will think about it will be discussed on Tuesday. You're looking at about a $300 million a year growing rapidly gap that the district itself has to.
What's the one time though? Is there a one-time number that's bigger?
No, sir.
So they're going to need $300 million come July 1st, right?
We're working on the mechanics of what they need exactly when. But the long-term trajectory is for the district, 300 this coming year, 350 the next year, and then will dramatically go up because of running into capital constraints. We'll run into capital constraints. I just want to say there's a context to evaluating anything. It's the elephant in the room.
I think that makes the case even more that we've got to figure out how to expand the base. Because if we don't think about expanding the base, we will never be able to cover these nuts. And we are in a downward spiral. So that's my own, I hear what you're saying, Glenn, and I don't disagree with you. But it seems to me that that's the time that you put out something really bold that's long-term thinking.
Again,
Nick, do you know what the process behind Act 22 was?
What's
No.
The Puerto Rico idea, which is, I think, what we're discussing potentially blowing up our
I don't know
timelines.
if it's Puerto Rico or if it's something else like that, but I just think talking about things that can expand the base are this is the time to do it.
The point I was going to make is that I'm sure that there was a longer process than just a couple of months to try and come up with like a really big idea that was going to be transformative. Like, I don't know that we can, recreate what they probably did over the course of like, I don't know. They could have spent a whole year on just that idea alone and figuring out what the.
Well, I think it's broad. I think what you're hearing though is broader than Puerto Rico. I think what people are saying is, for better or worse, rich or poor, people are not satisfied right now. And again, it's no reflection on staff. It's just that people are not satisfied with where we are in the analysis of competitiveness and where we are if we have done anything or need to do more, and people feel we need to do more in the area of which is related to competitiveness, what actions or measures can actually expand the tax base?
Well, I mean, it seems shocking that we just talked earlier today about the fact that we've already lowered the franchise tax before, and no one knows whether it was successful. But that was 10 years ago. So, I mean, that's why I'm saying, like, so we're still at a place where we don't think we're in the right place after having lowered it 2 points. It says to me that those things are not necessarily dispositive of where we want to get to, and that the cause and effect of these,
And I would say we
supply-side
said,
economics.
and I would say we did that, and we muddled it with all the other things we did to undermine the overall message, like messing with the estate tax and raising the income tax. That would be my argument back to you.
And we stated this before, that all of this though is so connected to the overall trajectory of the city. When crime is relatively low and the city feels good that these things don't matter as much. When we are where we are now, perhaps they matter a little bit more. But if the economy turns around, if crime turns around, if urban areas become cool again, if Comeback DC takes up these might be. There's so much we don't know, and I don't know that we can know with the kind of certainty that all of us want to have in 3 months, let alone 1 month.
I don't think it's a waste of time to learn more. I'm sorry, Gregory, I feel really strongly about this. We have to think about expanding our base. That you cannot deny that the city, it's losing its business community. You can't deny that. And we are losing our tax base. If we don't fill seats in offices, we're not going to be able to build our way out of this. And I'm all for doing things east of the river, that's for sure. I'm the first one to stand up for that, but that's not going to help us really expand our tax base. And we have to think about that both in individuals and in companies.
Jody, how are we going to pay for the tax relief that you want to provide?
I think we need to study exactly what it is, and we may have to take a longer view. But I don't think we can just say we can't afford it, so because then we're just in this downward spiral where I don't see any way out. I really don't see any way out.
The only painless, and not that it's painless, the only, I think, plausible way forward is to capture the revenue over expected revenue that we get from quarter to quarter, year from year. And it has been the history of the CFO not to play games with the revenue projections, but to be conservative and cautious, which produces these surpluses year after year. And I'm talking about capturing that and investing that in what we want in terms of competitiveness, et cetera. So not that we're going to gore the ox. I don't think anyone has said, take money away from social services. Not one person has said cut schools or cut Medicaid or cut housing. There's not been, as far as I can tell, not one discussion of cutting the most expensive safety net in the country by a factor of 2. No one has said that. But there are realistic pressures on this economy and on our economy that we have to be sensible about. Why not take and capture the surpluses and invest them in a triggered perspective to these competitive priorities? That's it. I don't know if we're going to get peer-reviewed certainty on any of this stuff. We're such an anomaly, as everyone likes to point out, and which is true. How we exist between these two low-taxing jurisdictions and so on, we're an anomaly. It's hard to pull facts and be like, oh, this is what's going to happen. We can only use our best judgment.
Well, I think part of this will become a lot clearer when we have a consensus among commissioners of, okay, we're going to do these incentives to be more competitive, to attract businesses, attract capital, but how are we going to pay for it? So how are we willing to broaden the base, expand the base, whatever term we're going to use, to capture some of that revenue that we're currently not taxing to pay for it? But handling the council and the mayor a plan with all sorts of competitiveness ideas with a $500 million hole in the budget is just not helpful. So I would love to hear these great ideas, but they have to be married with some idea of raising some revenue to pay for them. And I haven't heard a great discussion or unanimity about that as well. I think we're all interested in attracting more businesses and being competitive. Who's against that? How are we going to pay for it? And it's very good to talk about the long term. Council doesn't budget long term. They budget year to year.
Look, we've got a bunch of proposals here. What I'd like to see, and just would be helpful to know, when these are going, when Mayor, you're going to give us a collective presentation of what you've heard and what makes sense. Like, this does not seem terribly balanced to me in terms of the 5 priorities the council asked for. As far as jobs, it doesn't even exist on this. Like, I would like this chart to reflect the five items the council asked us to choose. These are proximities, but not the same. And I'd like to have an equal representation of the others so we can produce a balanced approach. then it can start to pixelate. The mayor will, no one's better understanding the city than he is. He's going to take a look at them. He's going to make his recommendation. It's not going to keep any of us from coming and saying, put on A, take off B. That we're free to do. And look, I have come a long way in my willingness to consider a business activity tax, provided there is an offset and provided there is a reduction to those who are currently paying. I'm willing to consider that, even though I don't like it. I don't like taxing nonprofit. I don't like, I don't like another tax on employees. And it may be that the revenue estimate that we have on the BAT at 0.5% only applies to for-profit entities. The time may be here. There's no way we are going to cover a WMATA shortfall, which wipes out all of this, Glenn, unless there is something asked of the nonprofit community. And why in the world they won't or shouldn't be asked to pay 0.5% is beyond me. Do we know how much that would be? If it's $250 million on our for-profit companies, and nonprofits make up a hell of a large part of our economy, that has to be hundreds of millions of dollars. And just as in New Hampshire, where they set a threshold, if it doesn't apply below, we'd set a threshold of where it doesn't apply below. So we don't have to clobber small businesses with the BAT, and we don't have to clobber small nonprofits. But we've got some sitting on a fortune.
I worry about that, David. We have a lot of exemptions in our code covering certain nonprofits that are actually under DC code, are not even nonprofits, like the American Heart Association, this and that. A lot of the value is in these federal, sort of nonprofits in DC that's serving the entire country, but they're still getting this
Right.
exemption because of congressional
Chartering.
Congressional chartering, but our tax code has lines for each of these organizations. You can't tax them, you can't tax them. So I worry that if we do go down this path of we're going to tax them, that it may be preempted by the federal government. I just see that as a high risk. So you end up with taxing local nonprofits, which really don't have the money unless they're universities or unless they're like theaters or things that own their buildings. Like that's where you're going to be.
So we challenge this, as you know, the council challenged this notion of federal preemption because these are enshrined in local law, even if they were, in fact, originally adopted by Congress.
That's correct.
They are enshrined in our local law, which we have the power to change. We do.
Let me try to make another, like a bigger point. It's where my mind has been. I think we need to acknowledge that we are at an inflection point when it comes to our revenues. Glenn will always be conservative, but we're not going to see the same kind of $300-400 million revisions because we've experienced this rapid assets inflation because of very low interest rates, and now we're not seeing that. So the added challenge is the headwinds that the commercial property market is facing, and I think the larger adjustments, my belief, are still ahead of us. We've reduced it by 25%, but I don't think we're done yet. So we're going to see some adjustments. So I think, and then we have the spending needs, the metro, all the money we've spent, paid for by federal government's funds that fell from the sky during the recession, and I think our tax regime is also facing challenges because our economic strength was our commercial property taxes, income taxes because of well-performing stock markets. That's not there anymore. So as the commission, I think our first charge is how do we increase our base and reduce the rates, or how do we shift our tax regime so it's matching the economic realities that we're facing? And I really don't want to be bogged down too much in the, both on the equity stuff. I know it's our charge, but a lot of the things that we're going to do through the tax regime is not going to solve the underlying root causes of that stuff. That's, I think, better sold through raising as much revenue as we can while creating as little distortions and disincentives as we can so we can invest in these programs. I would really like this group to focus a lot on sort of what is the tax regime for like tomorrow. and the years to come, and how do we really broaden the base and that allows us to raise revenue. I feel like we're spending a lot of time on things that we won't be able to answer, and I think this commission should also, I know we talked about this, but it's not our charge to talk about expenditures or the regulatory side, but it is our charge to make a really strong call for a serious assessment of these things. That's where I want to focus my attention.
So you don't think we need to further delve into competitiveness?
I think that the root causes of competitiveness is also very complex. It's like, I think the regulatory regime plays a very big role and we have to make a strong call for it. I think having a business tax regime that's simpler, for example, moving from the franchise taxes to a VAT, to me, is already a step in the right direction in terms of...
It's not a total rule, right?
Well, I don't want to take that off the table. I would like to see a world where we don't have any franchise taxes, we don't have any unincorporated...
I'm sorry for interrupting, but then we're not adopting the New Hampshire model. The New Hampshire model has both. The New Hampshire model has, what is it? It's
this could be DC model, David. This doesn't have to be New Hampshire model. I mean,
that would be madness. So let me share with you, if you don't mind, Yashim. The tax for profit tax in New Hampshire is 8.5%. They have a 0.75% BET, business, whatever, enterprise tax. So they have both. And
maybe that's where we end up.
But transferring the entire corporate tax burden to be an employee, a tax on employees is not the job growth that the council has charged us to do. It becomes just another.
Will you please stop calling this an employee tax? I mean, I think it's really sensationalizing it.
But that's what it is, Gregory.
No, but whether you're doing that and bringing in Virginia Ali's names and stuff, like, we don't need to sensationalize this stuff. Let's just call it what it is.
Well, Gregory, if you'll permit me, I'm my own boss, and I'll monitor what comes out of my mouth. And when you start paying my salary, you can start telling me what can and can't come out of my mouth. But what I'm telling you is I spoke with this state senator from New Hampshire today on this subject, a left-leaning one. And if you'll bear with me, the BET is a fraction of the tax that's collected on businesses. They still have an 8.5% tax on profit. So if you're selling the notion of we should do what they do in New Hampshire, it's not either or, it's both, friends. And it is a tax on employees, interest, and dividends. And what I've told you is that they've just eliminated taxes on interest and dividends. So the only thing left is a tax.
Employees are one way of doing it.
I think it's a different tax. The tax that they've eliminated on interest and dividends is essentially a personal income tax.
But for pass-through, it's the same thing.
In the business activity tax, interest and dividends will remain in the base as well as profits.
Also, why are we saying that we're not doing anything for competitiveness? We have on the table a reduction in the commercial property tax, we have a reduction in the franchise tax, and we have an elimination of the personal property tax. So who's saying we're not doing anything for competitive? Those are hundreds of millions of dollars of business tax relief that we've said we like. So it's just not correct to say that we're not doing anything on competitiveness.
But we haven't decided.
No, but they're on the table.
Agreed.
And we've spoken positively about them.
Agreed. And Gregory, all I think I'm suggesting is we need a list of all the 5, and then this thing pixelates, because if we're looking at all 5 in unison, this might make more sense than this.
Fair enough.
That's it.
But I don't think we should look at the colors on the map and say, oh, it's more green than it is yellow or red. But the thing is, there are a couple things on here on the competitiveness thing that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think the big issue that's coming up that Glenn raised is, maybe the fork in the road question is, we're handing the council and the mayor a tax plan that doesn't talk about the elephant in the room. And so does it make more sense to give them our plan before they have to address the elephant or after?
That's a question.
So I can see it both ways. Like they've got to get WMATA fixed and see where they are, and then they can address all this. Or they ought to get this in front of them and do WMATA simultaneously. I think that's the question, the fork in the road question.
What do you recommend?
What do I recommend?
You're in the room where they're discussing where and how the money is coming from WMATA. That's valuable. I'm not asking you to divulge confidence, but what do you think is most helpful for the overall process, the timing of our proposal?
I won't give you an opinion, but I will.
Why not?
I
Your
believe,
opinions are more-
I believe that there's a lot of pressure both in the district and outside the district to find more resources. There's also going to be a lot of pressure to put on WMATA one way or another to constrain costs because it's growing 6-8% a year easily and will in the future. So there'll be pressure both sides of the river and east of us to find resources, and then with more significant constraints on the operation. Now, so in that context, the big question is, what are the revenue streams that are available to deal with this without cutting into current services too much? And my guess is my observation is that there's a realization that both WMATA services and ongoing services in the other jurisdictions are going to have some trade-offs and reductions one way or the other. That right now, I don't think folks are thinking they're going to tax their way out of all of this. Whether it's entirely cuts in WMATA service or they're spread to the other entities who have to fork up more money, they'll be faced with not being able to tax their way out of it. That's my current thinking and observation with the meetings I've been in, and they're all public meetings. There's nothing surprising. So right now, there is no clear path, but a realization it has to be a variety of reductions and a variety of new revenues.
Glenn, there's also I will build on this question. We also have, at least per the adopted budget for 24, like $2.6 billion of one-time money that's balancing
Yes.
the financial plan. It's a pretty high number. There's not a single year in the financial plan where the recurring revenues are actually covering recurring expenditures. And it's quite possible that we'll get another year of high surpluses and then, plug in some holes, but it doesn't seem like we're in a fiscally sort of, like, maybe we can go through this, but where do you see the risks coming from on the expenditure side or like in the financial plan? What are some of what year do you think is like the problematic problems start beginning?
Outside of WMATA, I think it has to be labor cost pressures outside of WMATA. Because we're in a high interest rate environment. Remember, the two changes in our economy is high interest rates and high inflation. And hopefully the high interest rates will deal with the inflation issue, who knows? Let's hope our friends at the Fed here locally can figure that out. But that's the reality. Those two things trigger together with a sudden reduction in demand of commercial property, i.e. work from home environment, is putting us upside down, where our revenue growth will be less than the rate of inflation. So if you have to, that leads then to a labor pressure problem. And again, I don't mean employees are the problem, it's rather the expectation that you can keep them even with inflation and the cost they feel at home is really difficult when your revenues aren't going to grow that fast. And I appreciate the notion that we always overestimate or underestimate revenues. That's a legacy of a bunch of fortuitous events that have happened in a regime of really low interest rates that led to capital markets exploding, and from one coast to the other, forecasters are missing that impact. That's done. So in other words, when interest rates are low, that puts a lot of money and investment into capital. Whether it's stock market, which we tax through the income tax heavily, so there was huge revenues coming in that were unanticipated, or private property, residential property. And whether San Diego, Denver, Kansas City, or DC, those phenomena were happening, they're now gone. They're now stopped. With the additional problem of a lack of demand for commercial office space, and that also is coast to coast. So we're all facing this. How it works in our own area will be interesting. However, the key issue, you asked the question of what is the big cost pressure. From my perspective, it's being upside down, where our inflation rate is higher than our revenue stream growth, likely, and that puts electeds in a real bind to deal with the public servants.
My humble opinion, it's not just inflation, it's Thelma and Louise budgeting. You're basically approaching a fiscal cliff and you're like giving away free metro. It's like insane. You know, so, I mean, it's not you, but it's like the decision makers. I think if I were the decision makers, I would put together an emergency expenditure commission and come to us with recommendations and we vote them up or down to make the necessary hard choices so we don't end up with cutting everything like salami and then you have police cars don't work, human services are a joke, everything's in receivership. That's where I think we're headed if we don't make some real, and this gets back to this notion of need. And I know I can understand and that it's not our job to look at expenditures, but then at the same time, don't come to me and say, we need this level of taxation because of need, because I'm just telling you as someone who ran the place, you can't just give me this undefined notion of need when we went from 6 billion to 20 billion over however many years, and you're gonna tell me this is all bona fide, justified need? That's doing a disservice to where there really is a need.
But I mean, listening to Glenn, here's what stands out to me. First, this point that G greater than R, like growth rate is no longer greater than the interest rate, is a very important one. That's how we grow, right? That's when you can spend more and all of that stuff. That makes me think that we really have to focus on getting that growth rate up. We had like 3.5 years for recovery. We haven't really used the federal fund. It's not been our time yet. We haven't gotten there. But I think the second point that Glenn is raising, as I hear it, is that our hands are kind of maybe tied on the expenditure side because Metro is baked into the cake. Labor costs are not very easy to take down. You know,
they are easy to take down if you put in place a board like every control board for every bankrupt public sector organization gives you the ability to renegotiate contracts. You cannot say you cannot renegotiate contracts. You can. Especially when in Metro's case, a lot of these contracts you haven't even negotiated yet. You're just assuming what they're going to be 10%.
That makes it more important for this commission to provide recommendations to the mayor and the council as early as possible. Because if we don't, then the instinct will be not to have an expenditure commission, not to think about regulation, and raise money wherever they can without the benefit of advice from this group. So I think that argues for really getting this done by mid-December.
Could we consider a two-part report? An early part report that talks about just some of what Mayor Williams highlighted, kind of a philosophical call to mission in terms of major decision points in front of the city, and then follow that up after the budget process with all this stuff? Like,
I mean, I don't know how much effect it will have. I think most, legislative proposals work best if they're detailed. They're already you can tell them it has to be detailed. Otherwise, there's no incentive to follow any of that stuff.
But see, one thing that's belied here, and then I'll shut up. One thing belied here, like law school professor said, courts are a matter of, they theoretically are a matter of reason, and the political process a matter of will. A lot of this ultimately comes down to will, and it comes down to political organization. You know what I mean? We're going through a lot of analysis, but it's ultimately going to come down to a conversation between people on different sides to get the political body to enact certain things.
Let me ask the CFO a question. Would you be able to look at what a BET might look like for nonprofits based on, the
BET.
The BET.
Business
activities.
BAC.
In other words, the reason that you should have data based on what is it, the paid family leave?
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
We are in conversation with the Office of Revenue Analysis. They have great analysts. We can come up with an estimate of what it would look like to extend the, assume the business activity tax incorporates nonprofits. That's doable.
The thought being, look, and I'm not saying I support it. I'm saying I would
you
like
want
to
the
have the
information.
information.
Absolutely.
If we get to the end of this road and the hole is this big, it would be good to know, and if, again, with the appropriate cutoff of, if we don't want to tackle
Yeah, the same thresholds.
the small
We can look at a couple of different
nonprofits,
thresholds.
but 2, 5 million, whatever the number is, we identify as small. It comes from those above.
Yeah.
And we give them a year advance so they can start putting it in their budgets and so on. I'd just like to know what that would produce, a 0.5%, maybe a 0.75%. And that, then we go and say, look, everyone's gonna have to pitch in.
That's the gross receipt size on the revenues?
It's, I'm gonna make Gregory mad at me again, but it's a payroll tax.
No, I'm just asking you what you are thinking in
So
terms of
It's
like taxing
it's a
on.
bat, extending the bat.
It's a
to
business
nonprofits.
activity tax on nonprofits,
Extending the
so
bat to nonprofits, whatever the
They
analogous
call it
base-
business enterprise
base would
tax
be.
in New
Yeah.
Hampshire. We're calling it a
Enterprise
business
tax.
activity
Activity
tax.
There's a couple different ways to define the base, yeah. So, and I know it's getting late on a Friday afternoon, I wonder if it's time to sort of land this really helpful and interesting discussion. So I take from this a few things. So one thing to keep in mind is that, as you all have been doing this work and working your way through these proposals, the stakeholders who met with us back in the spring, who took their time to put ideas on the table, put forward a lot of ways to make the tax code better along the different dimensions that we've been talking about. Those proposals are on the table. We've now had 6 conversations about them, as well as the individual conversations that Mayor Williams and I had with each of you. And I think we have a good body of information, probably not sufficient information, but a pretty good body of information on some of the major themes that are emerging, on what you all would like to accomplish, what you all would like to see coming out of this report based on what we know now. So I think we have, from a staff perspective, I think we have three priorities. So one is to continue through with the process of, we have a town hall coming up. We've got over 100 people in DC registered to speak at our town hall on November 6th to respond to the proposals, to share what they're thinking. We're also inviting written comment. And so we've got that process to move forward and continue to hear from folks. And I don't want to short circuit that, even as we're talking about additional ideas or different perspectives. I think it's a good practice for us to follow through on that. Second, I think it would be helpful and instructive for us to come to you with for Mayor Williams to come to the rest of the commission with a straw man package of recommendations to respond to, which might call a chairman's mark, as soon as possible, even if not all questions have been answered, even if not everyone knows exactly where they're going. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is that we could honestly continue to meet for years and years and years, and there would always be more questions to answer and more things to research. And at some point, you kind of got to land this plane so that the next plane can take off. And so I would love to do that November 14th, and then figure out a plan that, as David said, involves a public comment period within reason, that allows us to get the additional information we need from stakeholders so that we can incorporate it into decisions, so that we can get, again, I'd love to stick to this plan of trying to get something concrete and actionable to the Council of Mayor in December, unless those of you who are in closer contact with them say, no, that's not the right timing. But until we're told otherwise, to continue to aim for that plan. And then a third stream is to try to get you all more information, particularly, Jody particularly mentioned interest in this, I know David's interested around some of these targeted tax incentives ideas. I can try to get you more. I will say it is if there were a evidence-based, research-based, tried and true method of creating tax incentives that really work for economic development in lots of circumstances, you would have been hearing about it from us by now. So there's a lot of judgment, so we can try any number of things, and we've tossed out lots and lots and lots of different possible models, and we're happy to explore lots and lots of different models, but at some point there has to be a leap of faith and just say, we're gonna try this, or we're gonna try that, or we're gonna set it aside and leave it for sort of the next, a future commission or a future iteration of this commission, but we need to keep going on these other two tracks of giving people a chance to finish giving their input into the proposals we've heard and putting it together into a package of recommendations that we can act on, even at the same time that we're exploring what some package of targeted incentives could look like. So I'm gonna give some more thought to what's an efficient and effective way to get you guys more information about some different options on incentives. I don't have it off the top of my head, but Richard and Becky and Mike and I will think about it, welcome your input. We'll talk to some other folks who are more knowledgeable in this area. We'll come up with some kind of plan on that front. So those are going to be our 3 priorities going forward. We meet next as a body. The next time on your calendars to meet as a body is November 14th, the evening of Tuesday, November 14th. So I propose we stick with that. We've got the town hall between now and then. It would be great if as many folks can come to as possible. But that's the evening of November 6th, and that's mostly for us to listen.
On the town hall, 100 people, okay, and you're gonna limit them to how many minutes each?
We've been thinking about the math. It's a challenge.
And the 2 I participated in before, the people to whom we were supposed to listen ended up asking us questions.
Yes, that's not.
And so we are not there to justify or explain anything that we've learned before, or else we'll never get out of the room.
Correct. It is entirely and it's been very clear in all the materials we put out. There's 80 proposals on the web, soon to be 90 as soon as we upload these. People can respond, are asked to respond to those.
So after is the plan for limiting?
After a few brief remarks, we have a great facilitator named Ray. He is going to be, I think in the end, not everybody who is in the room may have an opportunity to speak. Becky, do you want to say more to that?
So not everyone is going to come to speak. There are a lot of people coming to speak. And we're going to reach out to everyone who's RCP to figure out, do you plan to testify? And then once we know how many people will testify, we can decide on what time limit makes sense.
All right, so say 40 people want to testify. And this is supposed to last how long?
2 hours.
2 hours.
All right, my key math skills, that's 3 minutes each, without any. Okay.
That's
What we
$700,
do
you
for
might get
council.
more people.
We've been talking about 2 minutes.
Okay.
That's very hard, thank you.
That's, oh boy.
That is literally, I mean, we're not talking about much shorter than people get to testify before council. You go to a hearing, you get 3 minutes to say everything you want to say.
Are they being encouraged to submit written testimony as well?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Strongly encouraged. And now that we see the numbers, I think we have to strengthen our messaging on that front.
And what's the room we're gonna have this in?
The 5th floor event space.
Seats 160, I think.
Great.
Is that the amphitheater kind of place?
Not the
No.
amphitheater, the event space.
Do you have a sense of what you want our role to be beyond listening? Is there more role to play than that?
Good question. We give it some thought. I'll reach out.
Would it be possible to get a calendar of all of the next steps, the milestones? Our meeting on the 14th, when we might post the recommendations in the register, how long would you like to give them, when we're trying to, that would be helpful for us just to start planning.
I have to look into this register process. I'm not familiar with it, so we need to figure that out.
Okay.
I can put you in touch with you.
And if you need, we can use our friendships to move things along.
Yeah, I don't think it's, I think the question is getting comments back and being able to filter them into the process. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Have a good weekend. Bye, Jody.